Today I'm going to break down the difference between hyperpituitarism and hypopituitarism, focusing on the pathophysiology and what's happening inside the body. I'm going to keep this simple and practical. Think of this as understanding a control system inside the body, what happens when it's working too much, and what happens when it's not working at all. Before we compare the two things, we need to understand what the pituitary gland actually does. The pituitary gland is often called the master gland because it controls a lot of the other glands. For example, your thyroid glands, your adrenal glands, which is found on top of the kidneys, and the reproductive organs. So instead of doing everything itself, it's more like a manager giving instructions. If I had to explain it in a much more simpler way, imagine the pituitary gland as the boss in a factory. It doesn't build the items itself, but it tells all the other workers to do it for them. Now, here's the key idea for this whole topic. Hyperpituitarism is when the boss is yelling way too many orders and nobody's limiting it, and everything is happening too much. Hypopituitary is when the boss doesn't know what they're doing and it's barely giving any commands out. So things slow down, production is to a pause, and everything we talk about today comes back to that simple idea. So let's talk about the gland in a normal sense. There's a chain of command that happens. So it starts with the hypothalamus sending a signal to the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland then sends the hormones to the target organ. These target organs can be the thyroid gland, the adrenal gland, and those two glands are the ones that are actually doing the work. After that, the target organ sends feedback to where it came from, and it says like, hey, we've done enough. Think of it as like a thermostat in your house. You're the one setting the temperature, the heat turns on, and when the room gets warm, the thermostat shuts it off automatically. That shut off signal is called the negative feedback. So in a healthy body, everything is balanced, nothing's too high, nothing's too low, and we're going to look at what happens next when that system breaks. So we're starting with hyperpituitarism. This is when everything's out of control, everything's secreting too much. This usually happens because of a pituitary adenoma, so like a tumor in the pituitary gland. There's an extra tissue growth. Usually a benign tumor, even though it's not cancerous, it can still cause a big problem. It can cause the gland to produce too much hormones on its own, and it doesn't listen to the body. And now the feedback system is basically ignored. So going back to that analogy, imagine that boss in the factory is stuck yelling orders nonstop, and everybody's getting annoyed, everybody's getting heated, they're getting overworked. Even when work is already done, the workers just keep going and going. There's nonstop. They don't get 30-minute breaks like us nurses. And that leads to overstimulation of different organs. For example, if there's too much ACTH, this leads to conditions like Cushing's disease. And this is where the body produces too much stress hormone, which is the cortisol, like us nurses who have so much of that every damn day. Too much growth hormone can cause acromegaly in adults. That's also one of the hormones that can, be overworked. And overall, the body is in a constant state of too much. Now, in contrast, hyperpituitarism, the issue here is not overproduction, but underproduction. This can happen from things like tumors pressing down on the pituitary gland, brain injuries, a traumatic brain injury, Or this can be like the Sheehan syndrome, where blood flow to the gland is lost. So instead of the gland being overactive, it's either damaged or suppressed. Using the same analogy, so now your boss is very, very lazy. They either sleep on the job or they don't give any direction to follow. The workers don't know what to do, and production slows down or stops. So this can lead to decreased stimulation of other glands. For example, when you have low ACTH, you can end up having low cortisol, which results in adrenal insufficiency. And low TSH can lead to hypothyroidism. So instead of too much, this is a condition where everything is running too slow. Or none. In the side-by-side comparison, hyperpituitarism is about excess hormones, meaning too much, while hypopituitarism is about deficiency. In hyper, when you have too much, the system feedback is ignored, organs are overstimulated, and everything speeds up or grows too much. In hypo, this is when the signal is weak or missing. Organs are understimulated and everything slows down. And a simple way to remember this is hyper is when it's really, really hyper. And hypo is when there's nothing at all. And when you understand that concept, you can usually predict what symptoms a patient will have, like without memorizing anything. So let's connect this to a clinical setting so everything makes sense, because that's what we see in hospitals. In hyperpituitarism, think about this as excess production of hormones. This is when a patient would have Cushing disease, and with Cushing disease, they present with high blood pressure, weight gain, and a rounded face like mine. And in hypopituitarism, that's when they lack this stimulation of hormones. A patient with adrenal insufficiency might present with fatigue, low blood pressure, weakness, and as nurses, this matters because we don't just look at lab values, we also look at patterns themselves. If everything looks like it's in overdrive, think about hyperpituitarism. And if everything's slowed down or depleted, think about hypopituitarism. And this helps guide what labs to check and what complications to anticipate.